This is a ghost story based on real events. The ghost is that of a teenage girl, and she appears here in a wooded vale where the old turnpike road from Nottingham to Mansfield crosses a stream called Rainworth Water. Local legend has it that this was where Robin Hood first met Friar Tuck. I'm Simon Ford. I'm a writer and journalist, and I grew up around here. The girl's name was Elizabeth, or Bessie, or Bess Sheppard. She was just 17 when she met her death on this spot on Monday the 7th of July, 1817. Bessie had walked the 10 miles from her home in the village of Papelwick to the nearby town of Mansfield looking for work. She was wearing her new Sunday shoes, and she'd borrowed an umbrella because it had rained heavily the previous week. In Mansfield, Bess met Sarah Clay, the girl who told her about the prospect of a job. According to Sarah, Bess left Mansfield just before 6 o'clock in the evening. While she was trudging the muddy miles home, she was attacked, battered to death with a hedge stake, and her body tossed into a ditch. The place was marked by an inscribed stone, paid for by the gentleman of Mansfield, which read, "To the memory of Elizabeth Sheppard of Papelwick, who was murdered when passing this spot by Charles Rotherham, July 7th, 1817, aged 17 years. Decades went by. The old turnpike was widened. With the coming of motorised traffic, it had to be widened again, and this time it got a shiny tarmac surface. Each time the stone had to be moved, and each time the ghost of Bessie Sheppard appeared. The stone was refurbished in the 1980s, but now, having searched the area in both summer and winter, I can only find fragments of the concrete plinth it once stood on. The stone has gone, and nobody knows where it is." 33-year-old Charles Rotherham was a vagrant from Yorkshire, making his way south in search of work. His trade was scissor grinding, which he'd learnt before joining the army. Under Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, Charles Rotherham spent his 20s fighting the French and their allies across Europe. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, Rotherham and thousands like him were abandoned by the country they fought for. Arthur Wellesley became Field Marshal, His Grace and Serene Highness. Charles Rotherham hit the bottle, was kicked out by his wife, and left to tramp the highways and byways of Regency England in search of work. Nobody cared that for 10 years he'd hauled artillery from Albuera to Waterloo. The first 3 decades of the 19th century were marked by vast inequalities in wealth, social and political unrest, an ineffectual monarchy, a repressive government, and rapid industrialisation. Bessie Sheppard's home, Papelwick Village, had been dominated by a Regency oligarch, the mill owner Charles Robinson. His mill used water power to process cotton, but he went bust when steam-powered mills in Yorkshire took his business. Robinson was a tartar. His workers were little more than slaves. And here at the Church of St Michael and St James at nearby Linby are the unmarked graves of at least 160 children who died in his mill. In contrast, the parish borders Newstead Abbey, the luxurious mansion of Lord Byron, one of the glitterati of Regency London. Excess existed cheek by jowl with grinding poverty, and attempts to change the social order were brutally repressed. In fact, not far from here, in the month before Bessie Sheppard's murder, soldiers dispersed a protest by local labourers demanding fair wages. The leader of this march, an unemployed stocking maker from Sutton in Ashfield called Jeremiah Brandreth, was convicted of plotting to overthrow the government and executed for treason. He was one of 3 men hanged and then their bodies beheaded for their part in the so-called Pentrich Rising. The Tory government of Robert Jenkinson, the 2nd Earl of Liverpool, was paranoid about the risk of revolution. The administration was determined that what had happened in America in 1776 and in France in 1789 would not happen here in Great Britain. And the fear of revolution was heightened by tens of thousands of ex-servicemen, battle-hardened, disillusioned, bitter, and looking for payback. Men exactly like Charles Rotherham. Hi there, how you doing?
Hiya.
What ales have you got on, mate?
We've got the BG Sips, Old Tripe, Green King IPA, and we've got Abbott on.
I'll have a pint of Abbott, please.
Abbott, that's great.
Excellent, thank you. Rotherham spent Monday the 7th of July drinking heavily in Mansfield. I say heavily, maybe not by the standards of the day. One witness said he drank 6 pints of beer, which for a soldier of the period, I suppose, wasn't excessive. It was probably all he could afford. What we know about the events of the next few hours comes from newspaper reports, Bessie Sheppard's inquest, and Charles Rotherham's trial. Rotherham left Mansfield after Bess. We don't know if he followed her, but he soon caught up to her, and by the time he got here to a public house called The Hut, about 10 minutes from the murder site, he was carrying a bundle and an umbrella. Rotherham in fact walked past the hut, encountered a soldier acquaintance, one William Bell, and persuaded him to go back to the pub for a drink. They had a couple of pints, which might have taken 3/4 of an hour. Just mark that. The supposed murderer left the scene, possibly carrying stolen items that could link him to the crime, and is making a clean getaway when he stops, retraces his steps, and spends the best part of an hour in a pub a few minutes' walk from where the foul deed was done. Some 15 minutes before Bessie left Mansfield, her mother, Mary, set out from Papelwick to meet her. Bess was late and Mary was worried. Mary walked north towards the same toll bar, that's the checkpoint where horses and wagons paid to continue on the turnpike, that Rotherham was approaching walking south. Between the toll bar and here at the hut, a distance of, about 1/4 of a mile, Rotherham and Mary crossed paths. Mary waited at the toll bar for Bess to arrive, but she never came. It would soon be dark. Mary walked home through the dusk, past the hut, and my instinct tells me she probably called in to ask if anyone had seen her daughter. You've got to wonder, were Charles Rotherham and William Ball still in the back bar, supping their ale? Well, we'll never know, but what we do know is that the hut wasn't Rotherham's only stop. A few miles closer to Nottingham, he again paused for refreshment at the Ginger Beer House, before making his way to the 3 Crowns in Redhill, where he asked for a bed for the night. Rotherham had little money, so he offered everything he had for a night's lodging: a new pair of women's shoes and an umbrella. Quarrymen discovered Bessie's body early on Tuesday morning. According to an article in the Nottingham Review, her head was bruised in a shocking manner, one of her eyes being knocked out and her brains scattered about in all directions. Another newspaper reported, from the disordered state of the young creature's dress, there is reason to conclude her assailant had made some attempt upon her chastity. Bessie's body was taken to the Unicorn public house at Sutton in Ashfield, where it was placed in the cool of the cellar to await the arrival of the coroner. It wasn't long before 2 officers on horseback, Barnes and Linnegar, tracked down Charles Rotherham. He'd stopped at another pub, the Rancliffe Arms in Bunny, between Nottingham and Loughborough, where he sold the umbrella. They arrested him and took him back to the county jail in Nottingham. The Review article continues, Rotherham's clothes were spotted with blood, and since his arrest he has confessed to the perpetration of the horrid deed. Now, justice in the Regency period was swift and it was brutal. Bess was murdered late on Monday the 7th of July. Rotherham was arrested on Tuesday the 8th. The coroner's inquest sat on Wednesday the 9th, and then the next day, Thursday the 10th, Bess was buried in Papelwick churchyard. Rotherham was arraigned at Sutton in Ashfield on the 14th of July and committed for trial at the Nottingham Assize, which so happened to be sitting the same month. Therefore, Rotherham was tried on Friday the 25th of July. He offered no defence, was found guilty, and was hanged the next Monday, the 29th of July 1817, 3 weeks after the murder. So, what did Charles Rotherham have to say for himself? The Nottingham Journal records the testimony of Ben Barnes, one of the arresting officers. He passed her without taking any particular notice and proceeded on till, feeling himself weary, he sat down by the road to rest. Just as the young woman came up, the horrid idea entered his head of murdering her. The Nottingham Review reported, he could not tell what possessed him at that moment. He never spoke to the woman, but the moment he got up to her, he struck her on the head and repeated his blows till she was lifeless. What accounts of the confession and trial fail to record is why Charles Rotherham murdered Bessie Sheppard. There's some evidence that helps us fill in the gaps. It could have been a sexually motivated assault. The Nottingham Review, the newspaper that reported the disordered nature of Bessie's dress, speculated. It is not improbable that the efforts she made to resist him had aroused the fury of the wretch and determined him to instantly deprive her of life. Not improbable. And robbery? Well, the Review reports some quarrymen going to work the next morning near the spot observed some halfpence lying on the ground, which induced them to look further. So, Rotherham stole Bessie's shoes and umbrella, maybe some money she'd made in Mansfield, dropping a couple of low-value coins in his haste, which could explain how he was able to buy beer for William Ball and himself here at the hut. These shreds of evidence don't tell us whether Rotherham was a psycho. His cool, detached behaviour after the murder is puzzling, but let's remember he was a military veteran with 10 years active service. Today there'd be psychiatric reports and doctors would be called in his defence. In 1817, Charles Rotherham put one foot on the gallows the moment he picked up that hedge stake. And that would be where the story ends and the protagonists fade into obscurity, were it not for that memorial stone. The stone that survived the best part of 2 centuries, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, was refurbished in the 1980s and has now, mysteriously, disappeared. Has it been stolen, or taken somewhere safe, or just smashed up for hardcore, which is my fear? In which case, has Bessie Sheppard's ghost vanished with it? I'm going to keep looking and asking questions. I'd like to think that if the stone is replaced, Bess will be able to rest in peace. Hi Jack, good to see you.
And you?
For those of you who don't know, this is Jack Morell and I'm Simon Ford, and together we are Psycho Killer, along with Pip Watts and Carl Cooper, who's currently behind the camera. We've been investigating the Bessie Sheppard story, the murder case from 1817. We have some news for you at the end of this podcast, so stick around. But first of all, Jack, from your research, what can you tell me about the police service as it was in 1817 at the time of the murder?
It was very, very different. I mean, we'd had, people know the term bobbies and peelers and what have you, and the Bow Street runners came in sometime before then, but policing really was in its infancy. In fact, Robert Peel became, I think, Home Secretary shortly after this case, and really brought on the Metropolitan Police and policing itself. But it was very basic. But on saying that, it was run on sort of parish, local level policing. You know, it was still done with a degree of pride and an investigative nous, I suppose.
So the officers who were dispatched to track down Charles Rotherham, what sort of people would they have been? Would they have been police officers as we understand them today?
No, they would have been parish constables, and they would have had far less training and certainly legal training. But the ethos is what I think I want to get across. Is they had the same pride, the same ethos to get to the bottom of whatever they had to look into. And that view hasn't changed, even looking into the Bessie Sheppard case. And I know some writing, or some people have written about it and theorised about various aspects to it. But yeah, I'm still a proud cop, even though I finished a few years ago.
We've got the book here actually, which was the spark for all of this. Just let me grab it here. This is a great book. It's the second edition of this book by a guy called David W. Marshall, and it's called The Murder of Bessie Sheppard. And in it, Mr. Marshall proposes a number of theories around the murder case, which he considers to be inconsistencies, and has his suspicions about the way in which the case was conducted, and also the motivation for putting in place the memorial stone. And it's got me wondering as well. You know, I've been following this around now for about 18 months, and it gets under your skin. And one of the things, you know, I've wondered is, what was the motivation for putting a memorial stone beside a road where normally somebody would have a gravestone that memorialised them in a churchyard? And Bessie Sheppard has one of those, albeit a fairly hidden, scrappy one. Well, what was the point of the stone, do you think?
Well, it was described as being placed there by the gentleman of Mansfield, and from what I understand is that it said that Bessie had gone to meet a friend in order to get work in Mansfield, because she lived in a village a few miles away. And I don't doubt that, and what I feel is, even though it wasn't officially recorded as such, I think she found work with the same company that her friend was working at a textile mill. And I think because of what happened to her on her way home, I think the gentleman of Mansfield, the philanthropic, liberal textile mill owners, who we know they were sufficiently moved and had a conscience, almost felt a responsibility to it. I don't see any more than that, and that it was a gesture of shock, revulsion, and also to keep Bessie's memory alive, which, you know, has been achieved because we're talking about her now.
We are indeed. Oh, yeah. I mean, from my point of view, I was looking at, you know, this particular period of English history was incredibly turbulent. I think it's safe to say that Great Britain was teetering right on the event horizon of a revolution, like the one that had happened in the 13 colonies in America, like the one that happened in France in 1789. And the government was extremely repressive because they wanted to prevent that kind of proletarian revolution taking place. And the more I read about this, the more I realised that Nottingham and Nottinghamshire was really the epicentre of a lot of this discontent and a lot of this activity, demonstration, protest. The character of Ned Ludd, for instance, first made an appearance, a fictitious character, but Ned Ludd first made an appearance during a demonstration in Nottingham in 1811, and was analogous with Robin Hood. And of course, Bessie Sheppard lived right in the middle of Sherwood Forest. The crime took place in Sherwood Forest, reputedly at the spot where Friar Tuck fought Robin Hood.
There's a lot of unrest, and don't forget, this is the end of the Napoleonic Wars. We've got people like Rotherham, we'll come on to him in a bit, we've got people like him, war veterans, a lot of them physically injured, a lot of them really messed up and not in a good place, and they're wandering the lanes of England, looking for work or just looking to carry on with life. It's a messed up society at that time. Regardless of whether policing is in its infancy, the political unrest was huge, as you've said.
I'm interested to see that the mills of Hancock and Wakefield were owned by liberal reformers, because mill owners in this period are characterised as repressive and the opposite of liberal. And I think Charles Robinson's an example of that, the man who owned or had owned the mills in Papelwick, and also in the West Riding of Yorkshire, where steam power was being used to process cotton a little later in this period. Mill owners were dragged out and murdered by mobs, and yet, also private security hired by mill owners to protect their premises would fire on demonstrators, and multiple people were killed. And which leads us on to the Peterloo Massacre, August 1819, and by that Christmas the good gentle of Mansfield had erected this stone, and it did make me wonder, and also it made David Marshall wonder whether or not they were cementing one version of the truth in the face of a contradictory version of the truth. They weren't as liberal as they made out to be, and there was something strange going on in the woodshed, if you like.
Simon, I think the key to what David Marshall is speculating on, and I can't fault him for doing it. However, what he's relying on are two newspaper reports of the case at the time, with limited information, but specifically about the witnesses who were called for the trial and the various aspects of the trial. In those days, they weren't relying on a court transcript, blow for blow, every word that's said for the defence, for the prosecution, what the judges said, judges' directions. These kind of things weren't recorded in that level of detail, nor are we looking at the case material of what the officers actually did. And even though there are questions about how much they did, I'm pretty sure that they investigated it as thoroughly as was required in that time.
So we have, if you like, all of the meat but none of the fat.
Exactly.
All of that was shaved off before the case got to court.
Yes.
And it didn't come out in the public domain. So all of the things that David Marshall's talking about, we will never know for sure. But quite possibly, in your opinion, you think that they would have been discussed, and then one by one, those factors would have been eliminated and not put to the jury.
Exactly. Well, he talks about how quickly and how conveniently they found Rotherham and got his confession and put him before the court, and eventually he hung for his crime. What I'm pretty sure is they did the other background inquiries, which would be natural to any investigator, whether you're trained or not, to ask the questions. And I'm sure they covered those bases, but they weren't relevant to the trial. They didn't add anything to the actual prosecution case. So it's what we now call, when we go to trial, so agreed facts. The defence and the prosecution will agree certain facts. That's not in dispute, so it's spoken about and recorded officially, but it's never actually examined in evidence. The live witnesses that were called were, I think there was eight civilian witnesses and maybe 2 or 3 police officers or official staff. That's quite normal. They're significant witnesses. They need to be heard for the judge to be sure that the trial is fair and that all the witnesses have been listened to.
And this is a common thread that runs all the way through English jurisprudence. I'll try that again. This is a common thread that runs all the way through English jurisprudence right up to the present day.
It does. I mean now prosecutors, they don't want to muddy the waters and put too much detail in to confuse people or to just make things a little bit untidy. They want to keep to the key witnesses, the key facts, so that the right decision by the jury, whoever it may be, is reached.
Let's talk about Charles Rotherham. What do you make of this character?
Well, what's not recorded in those newspaper articles is anything about his background. It's all about his confession and what he did on the day and how he tried to escape justice by continuing on his journey. I think it was to Loughborough. Charles Rotherham was clearly in a bad place, wasn't he? Mentally, without any shadow of a doubt. He'd served in the army for several years. We don't know about his own upbringing, his own family background, but he'd returned to, I think, a wife and a child was...
Yeah.
Yeah. After...
At least one child.
Yeah.
In Sheffield.
After several years of serving for Queen, King and country, whatever it may be, abroad. And he comes back and the marriage is not viable anymore. And he ends up drifting, as many did. You know, who knows what state of mind he was in. People say, well, he'd been drinking in pubs. Well, for those that don't know, fresh water didn't arrive in most of the UK until about 30 years after this. So people got the refreshment from alcohol. So they were pretty alcohol tolerant.
Children were given small beer, weren't they? Which was a little bit of beer just to kill the bugs in the water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think he was a lonely, desperate man drifting through the English Midlands. Why he did what he did, we still don't really know in terms of motive, albeit he admitted to doing it.
Do you think that he was coerced into making that confession? I've got this picture in my mind of, you know, the lost hours between Loughborough on the road through to the county jail in Nottingham, where perhaps those two police constables managed to knock a confession out of him.
I don't know the interview techniques of those officers at the time.
There was no pace.
There was no pace, and they weren't tape recording that interview,
No.
and they weren't video filming any interaction with Charles Rotherham. But the circumstances that led to his arrest were that he called into various public houses. He'd intimated that he was travelling to Loughborough. He'd got possessions that belonged to Bessie Sheppard with him on effectively the night that she went missing. They caught up with him and he soon confessed. Now, I don't know the methods that those officers used. However, people do confess, or they at least make comments or statements relevant to what they've done, because, you know, they're messed up people. You know, I don't think he's stalked the country looking for somebody like Bessie Sheppard. I think the moment's come. We don't know what interaction there was with her, what was said, whether it was sexually motivated or just his own pent-up anger. I'm reasonably confident he would have made some admissions to what he'd done. That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, we tend to, or at least I've tended to, consider his behaviour from the point of view of somebody who is of sound mind. At least that depends whether you think I'm of sound mind or not. But you know, somebody who is not in that terrible emotional, psychological spot. And I suppose there are parallels today with military veterans who, also with, you know, the Vietnam era, who've come back and are unable to integrate into society. I thought at one point maybe Bessie Sheppard, and again here I'm playing, you know, David Marshall's game here. She might have seen him collapsed at the side of the road and went over and tried to help him. And in that instant he woke up and smashed her over the head because he thought she might have been a French or a Spanish soldier. Or she might just have walked past him and he'd been lying in wait thinking, she's got a few bob on her and I could use that better than she can. You know, it's just, there'll never be answers to questions like that, but the pursuit of them is just so delicious, isn't it? And seductive, I think, you know, for people like me. And I shouldn't do that because I'm a journalist.
From what
You're a copper.
From what I gather, though, there was one key witness, wasn't there, who saw Rotherham walking ahead of Bessie,
That's
not
right.
together.
That's right.
So Rotherham talks about stopping and then making his attack on this girl, and he even describes where he found the fence stake or took the fence stake from to do it. What is not clear is what interaction there was. Was he just so miserable and fired up that merely the sight of a young, clean girl, 17-year-old,
That's right, yeah.
who's just has got herself a job. She's maybe full of life, skipping along in her best clothing and her best Sunday shoes, and maybe that was just enough for him to resent the presence of this girl. Or maybe there was a conversation. Maybe she did ask him if he was all right because he was falling asleep, and he resented that. But something's happened, something's snapped. But the point is that there was no suggestion that they'd had any interaction beforehand. It was a complete strange. She was a complete stranger to him, and it was that moment on that quiet, secluded road, for want of a better word, south of Mansfield, on the way that he committed that horrendous act.
So there could have been something completely innocuous that she said that triggered him. You know, it's not necessarily, you know, how dare you accost a young girl? What sort of coward are you? And at that moment, you know, the red mist descends, and the next thing you know is he's holding a cudgel in one hand, covered with pieces of Bessie Sheppard's head, and in the other hand an umbrella and some shoes. You know.
Red mist is the right word. I mean, in the book it talks about all this sort of speculation about how he suddenly behaved normally and then went to the next pub and had a pint with another soldier who he met on the road. What I know from experience, and one particular case, we covered it, didn't we, a few months ago. Paul Hutchinson, the killer of Paul Colette Aram at Keyworth, also in Nottinghamshire. Well, after the most vile act that he committed against Colette, he rolls up in a public house on his own, calm as you like, orders a drink and a bite to eat.
Yeah, he had a ham sandwich, didn't he?
Had a ham sandwich.
And he washed his hands in the lavatory, and that's how eventually you and your team nailed him through the DNA that was on the towels.
There was nothing odd about him apart from him being a stranger in a pub, and he got blood on his hands. That's the only thing that drew attention to him.
And he drank orange squash, didn't he? Which the police at the time said, that's not a real man's drink. We drink pints of beer. Something wrong about this one. Which I quite like. That was on the Crime Watch program, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, Bessie Sheppard's killer was found within a day. Paul Colette Aram's killer, it took 26 years to find him. So, and that's with modern day technology. So there we are.
But Nottinghamshire police always get their man, right?
They do.
Absolutely. I was thinking as well about Bessie Sheppard, you know, and the idea that the way that she's become totemic, hasn't she, of the wounded woman, of the innocent victim of the brutish man and the terrible times in which people lived. And there was part of me which said, well, I need to challenge that assumption. Maybe Bessie Sheppard, you know, wasn't all sweetness and light. Maybe she'd been into Mansfield to meet Sarah Clay to do a very different kind of job from the one that you supposed.
Yeah.
You know, these were desperate times. She was a young girl. Her mother was widowed. There were other siblings in the family. She had to make money any way she could, so she put on her Sunday best and she went into Mansfield to sell herself.
I hear that, and it's a little bit salacious. I don't think there's any substance to that. For this reason, is we know that Bessie Sheppard's family in Papplewick were God-fearing. They were quite strong morals. They were a good, clean family. In fact, Bessie had chosen to go to a church, I think in Hucknall nearby, and join them. She was a clean, polite, well-mannered young girl.
Again, she was nonconformist. The family was nonconformist at a time when that was another sign of rebellion. You know, they were breaking away from the Church of England. They were Unitarian rather than Trinitarian, and all of these religious aspects to life that were part and parcel of every day in the early 19th century.
Yeah. I mean, if Bessie had been, as you say, maybe or interested in working as a call girl or whatever the term would have been then that would suggest that maybe there was some kind of interaction with her and Charles Rotherham, in terms of offering her services or him inviting her for services. But there's no suggestion of that. He's not alluded to anything like that. There's nothing to say that she had done anything other than seek work at the textile mill that her friend had been working at. It's all good for the gossip, but these background inquiries would have been made, and if she was the clean living girl that it appears she was, then I'm happy with that.
I'm glad you are, because I am too. I've got a lot of time for Bessie Sheppard, actually, and what she was trying to do. She was learning to read. She was trying to better herself. She walked. It was wet and muddy those days in July when she, before she died, there'd been thunderstorms. The road would have been churned up, and she tramped all the way from Papplewick, which is 10 miles or something, 7 miles maybe, into Mansfield. And then she tramped all the way back after a day's work. And it's incredible, actually. I think about Charles Rotherham and the time it took him, even in a semi-inebriated state, to travel from Papplewick all the way down to near Loughborough. Right, this is 30 odd miles.
Yeah,
and he
did 3 miles an hour.
I was going to say at 3 miles an hour, but maybe a bit more, because he covered that. He covered that road. Maybe he got a lift on a cart. I don't know, but this is what people did. They just walked.
Sure.
And Bessie Sheppard. It's a little bit like the story of the Welsh girl, who walked barefoot to get her Bible. There's part of that in it. Maybe this is me being a sentimental old fool, really. But I'll tell you something about the funeral service at Papplewick Church. The rector at Papplewick was satisfied that there should be a funeral for Bessie Sheppard there and that she should be interred in the churchyard, but he was less pleased that the congregation of the nonconformist church turned up to sing at the graveside. And after a bit of argy-bargy, this was reported in one of the newspapers, the rector conceded to let these people come into the churchyard, and I can only imagine that her mother would have been one of them, but to observe the funeral and to pray. And then, I suppose, during the interment, they struck up with a hymn, which was a nonconformist hymn.
And he objected to it.
He objected to it to the point where he chucked them out of the churchyard. The reporter put this in the newspaper, and the rector then sued the editor for libel, because he said it lowered him in the estimation of right-minded people generally, because these people are nonconformists.
So church
and state, the whole thing,
have infected the case as well.
Yeah,
right,
it's all. Talk about the deck being stacked against Bessie Sheppard.
Yeah,
she's emblematic of ordinary people, working people, country people. In this period in English history.
And this is why.
Maybe that's why the memorial was raised.
Exactly.
Maybe that's why it was raised.
The memorial stone, I think, is not down to guilt of those seedy men who were involved in some kind of prostitution racket or some other nefarious activities in Mansfield. I think they were genuine, respectful mill owners who saw that poor Bessie had died as a consequence of her seeking good, honest work at the mill in Mansfield, and they felt duty-bound to do something in her memory.
That's a great way of looking at it, and I'm happy, actually. I'd take your word as a former police officer. They always say, don't you, if you want to answer, talk to a policeman. So yeah, that does it for me. I think, you know, Bessie is exonerated, and I feel a bit grubby for suggesting that she was anything other than.
Well, you've thrown in the ideas that were in that book, and the kind of speculation and the kind of questions that the public do rightly ask, but it depends on the amount of information that they're given in the first place,
and also the battle with the press as well. At this point, you know, this was a point where, you know, movable type had been around for centuries, but the big thing was literacy, and people were able to read. So, you know, the Peterloo massacre, that achieved such notoriety because there were eyewitness accounts written by journalists of the massacre in the Manchester Guardian, and then of course the increased mobility meant that this news spread throughout the country. Fascinating period of history, and a terrifying period to live through, I would imagine as well. I said that there was going to be a bit of a reveal at the end.
You've been doing some work.
We've been doing some legwork, and I have to defend myself here in that I've got reasonably good eyesight, and I have been up and down the A60 at that spot at least 3 times in 18 months looking for this stone, and on 3 occasions I could not find it. I know you've been to Rainworth Water and you've not found it, and I think Carl, who's behind the camera, he's been for a mosey down there and he couldn't see it either. But I had a conversation with a good friend of psycho killer Paul Bradshaw, who spoke to a contact at Nottinghamshire County Council. And the last time that I went down there, I noticed that an area had been cleared in the verge, which, trust me, was like a jungle. And the stone is there. I don't think it's been moved. I think it was there all along, but it was just overwhelmed by brambles and briars and nettles and rolled up old carpet and goodness knows what.
And items strewn from cars as they sped by.
Just as they went screaming past. I mean, it strikes me as well today that it's a dodgy spot, and maybe it was always a dodgy spot. You know what I mean? It's quite swampy down there. If you stray off the path, you find all kinds of debris and refuse. One of the reasons I didn't want to go delving around in the leaf litter was because of needlestick. I'll be honest with you. I've done some archaeology. I prodded around with a big long pole, but I wasn't going to go, right down in there in case I got spiked. But
we found it.
But we found it. We found it.
Excellent.
Psycho Killer have, in one small way, revealed once more the stone to Bessie Sheppard.
Yeah. Well, she deserves it.
She does. And when I went to the churchyard at Papelwick, I found the stone there, her gravestone, which is mentioned in David Marshall's book, and it was overgrown. And I was so fired up at the time, I just got down on my hands and knees and ripped the grass off it to reveal it, because I felt at that point, I thought genuinely that stone had either been pinched to go in some posh person's garden, or it had been smashed up for hardcore by somebody who didn't care. So I cleared that grave off with my bare hands. And on the way out of the churchyard, I found myself humming the hymn tune Crimond. And I looked up on my phone the words of the hymn, the title of the hymn, which had caused so much consternation at the funeral, the one that the Unitarian congregation sang. And as I was walking up the drive, scrolling down on my phone, said, "Set to Crimond." And there's part of me feels, I'm not a superstitious person, but there's part of me feels that Bessie was kind of saying, go on, keep going.
Sure.
So yeah, we've hopefully, in our small way, we've done our bit for Bessie.
I think so, and well done.
Yeah, cheers. Here's to Bessie. Hope you enjoyed that. We're going to do a few more videos, I think, in the future, but For now, this is Psycho Killer, and do come back for more great true crime exploration and discovery.